This chapter is about the 14th century, which is the 1300s. The 1300s in Europe were a time of transition. It was the end of the medieval period and the beginning of Renaissance. And so there are a lot of transitions in the artwork, in the literature, and just in the overall culture of Europe. Sometimes this time period is called Trecento, which means 300 because this was 1300. And there was not a clean break from the medieval period. It took, 100 years, a whole century for the transition to occur because there were so many natural disasters, disease, and violence. There was so much that happened during this century that affected how quickly the culture was able to progress and change. Here is a map of how the Black Death or the bubonic plague affected Europe. It began in 1348 in China, and it's called the Silk Road, the route that the goods from China took as they entered Europe. And presumably, the bubonic plague entered Europe with fleas who infected rats who were on the ships from China. And so as it came into Europe, you see how quickly it spread all across Europe, and it decimated about 1/2 of the population of Europe. The effects of the bubonic plague were particularly felt in Italy. It is said that in Italy they lost about 2/3 of their population, so there was a great population decline. One of Italy's writers at the time was Boccaccio, and Boccaccio wrote a piece of work called the Decameron, and in it he depicts some travelers who were there in Florence, and they were trying to escape from the plague. And so they left the city and went out into the country. And it is 10 tales. Decameron means 10. It is 10 tales about these people. And they each one told a tale. And they had different sorts of tales that they told. It's rich in human comedy. It's rich in just the way people were feeling and what was going on at the time. Most people point to the Decameron as a very good representation of the plague itself, because he gives an eyewitness account to the plague. As these people tell the different tales, let me tell you what these words mean. Fabuleux, as you see there, that is a short, comic, vulgar tale. We would call it a dirty story today. So you had one of the people escaping the plague who was telling that. You had the exempla tale, which is a moral story, and you had a romance. This doesn't mean lovey-dovey, boy meets girl and all that. What it means is it's a knightly tale. The knights usually told romances where you did have a damsel in distress, and the knight would go in and save the day. So it's that type of romance. The Decameron has often been called a human comedy versus the Divine Comedy that Dante wrote and that we talked about in the last chapter, because he is writing more, he being Boccaccio, is writing more about people. He's writing about the foibles, the eccentricities, just the way that people are in real life and the way they would have acted if they were scared for their lives from this bubonic plague. So that's why his is called the human comedy. Besides the disease that we saw during the 14th century, there was also a problem with Catholicism, and it's called the Great Schism or the Great Break. The Catholics supported one of 3 popes, so there were 3 different popes that the Catholics could choose. So the Christians obviously were divided over this with the rival popes. And it started when Philip the Fair of France kidnapped and abused Boniface VIII, who did die, and then Philip the Fair of France put forth his own candidate for Pope and moved the papacy, moved where the Pope lived and conducted all the business of the church from Rome to southern France. So that's what that Avignon papacy means, because that is in southern France, and it is sometimes called the Babylonian captivity. I don't know if you remember in chapter 6 where we talked about how the Jews were captured by the Babylonians, and they lived in Babylon for 70 years before they were returned to their home country. It's the same here, that the papacy was captured and taken to France and was there for a while before it was returned to Rome. So by 1378, there were three rival claimants to the papacy, to who was going to be pope. And it was eventually settled, but not before there were problems in all of Europe and in the Roman Catholic Church because of this. People started calling for church reform. You saw this, first of all, in France and in Italy, and then it even spread to England in the Peasant Revolt of 1381. And John Wycliffe, who was a translator of the Bible, he cried for reform in the church, and this Peasant Revolt is where the Robin Hood myth got started. Another problem during the 14th century was the Hundred Years' War that took place between France and England. And it was fought mostly on French soil, and it did a lot of damage to France. Three main battles at Poitiers, Crécy, and Agincourt. And there were mercenaries, those who were paid to fight for England. They weren't necessarily English, though there were plenty of English there. They went all about the country, raping, stealing, robbing, killing, burning. So a lot of death and destruction. The English won because of the introduction of the longbow, a particular type of bow and arrow that could go further and could kill more. But, supposedly this battle was over who became the king of France, but really it was over the wool in Flanders. There were valuable sheep who lived in Flanders, and their wool sold for a lot of money. So it's over money and control like most wars are, and there was much bloodshed. Prominent writer of this time was Francesco Petrarch, who lived in Italy. He was from Tuscany. He lived south of Florence, and he was quite the scholar. He wrote a lot, but first you have to recognize what a scholar he was, and that he translated works from both Latin and Greek. And as you see here, he collected and copied these ancient texts, and so he had a lot that he was able to put into his writing when he wrote his own original works because of this study. He did become the Poet Laureate of Rome in 1348, which that is the official poet of a country. And they would write poems, and they would present these, say them at occasions of state, when there was something with the monarchy or something with the church in this case. So it's a very high honor to be the Poet Laureate. Though he is writing during this time of transition, he is more like a Renaissance writer because he has some of the characteristics that we will see later with the Renaissance. Very interested in self. He has a desire for personal glory and fame, and he writes about this in a work called Secretum. In Secretum, he wrote as if he were in conversation with Augustine, sometimes called Saint Augustine, from 1,000 years earlier. Augustine wrote in the 300s, and he wrote letters for the church to help the church on its way. It was starting to lose its way, so he was helping the church. And so he studied Augustine and wrote Secretum as if he was in conversation with Augustine. And then he wrote Letter to Posterity, which was based on Augustine's Confessions. Confessions is about how Augustine came to God, the sin that he had in his life, and how he owed everything in his life to God, and how he eventually came to God, and he was a priest in the Catholic Church. So he wrote that was modeled after Augustine, and it is one of the very few autobiographies that we have after Augustine's Confessions and before Rousseau, who wrote, he was a Romantic writer in the 1800s. So very important work. As I've already mentioned, he did read the Latin writings, he studied the Latin masters, but what Petrarch is most known for is his vernacular poetry. Remember that vernacular is something that's written in the common language of the people. So it wouldn't be written in the Latin of church and government. It would be written in the common Italian of the day. His work Canzoniere, which has sonnets in it, and canzoni, which means is a song. Canzoniere means a song book. And his sonnets were primarily inspired by Laura. Laura was his love interest, and she was presumably the most perfect woman there ever was. So most of his sonnets are all written about Laura, seeing Laura, talking to Laura, all of that. By the way, a sonnet is a 14-line poem, and there are two main types of sonnets. The Petrarchan sonnet, named after Petrarch, which has a rhyme scheme of A, B, B, A, B, B, A, C, D, E, C, D, E, or C, D, C, D, C, D, and which is set up in its thought pattern, its structure in an octave, which is 8 lines, and a sestet, which is 6 lines. I will talk about this a little bit in class, but I wanted you to know a little bit about the Petrarchan sonnet, and the other type of sonnet is the Shakespearean sonnet, obviously named after Shakespeare. So Petrarchism has become known because of his sonnets and his sonnets about Laura. It has become known as an attitude towards women, in praise of women, and putting women up on a pedestal as perfect. And so if you ever hear that term Petrarchism, that is what it is referring to. Another prominent writer during this time period is Chaucer. He lived in England. He was a civil servant, came from a middle-class family. He wrote poetry. He, of course, did translations from the Greek and Latin. But he is remembered for writing in English, being one of the very first to write in English. Of course, Beowulf was written in Old English by an unknown scholar, but Chaucer writes in what is Middle English for the people, and he uses the English language as a literary vehicle. He writes for the ordinary person to read. It's not for the church, it's not for government. One of the great things about Chaucer is that he was very skilled in observing humans. He was one of those people who could read people. He would meet someone and he would remember the details about how they looked, how they acted, and he could figure out their character from just coming to know them. And so he was not only able to be very skilled in observing people, but then he was skilled in writing about it. So he could put that into writing and create these characters that we still know. There is another slide, a whole slideshow that I'll be showing you in class about the Canterbury Tales, a little bit more detail than I'm going into here. But just generally and overall, the Canterbury Tales is set up as a frame tale, which means we have a story within a story, and I'll talk about that more. And the Canterbury Tales is remembered because we learn about all different types of people from the Middle Ages. It is the perfect cross-section of medieval society. We learn about the very lowest members of society to the very highest, which would be the knight, and then the clergy, and then the middle class, and then the low workers. And it is a social commentary on what's going on during the day. Through these people who tell the tales, then we learn about life during the Middle Ages. Chaucer was greatly influenced by Boccaccio because he set it up in the same way where he had individual pilgrims who told different types of tale. He had the fabuleux and he had the exempla, he had the romance, just like Boccaccio did. And through their tales, we learn about the people themselves and about the society in which they lived in. Christine de Pizan is the first female professional writer, and that is what she is remembered for. She is from Italy. She was born in Venice, and she was married, but after 5 years, both her husband and her father died. So she was left penniless, and she had to support her family. So she had to think of a way to raise money. She was very interested in literature, and so she wrote. She wrote 15 books and was successful in supporting her family off of her writings. At the time, there was a great literary debate over a work called The Romance of the Rose. And in this long, rather tedious poem that was written in French, at the end of it, Jean de Meung attacked women in it. And so his misogyny came out, and she responded to that by writing a letter to the god of love, and then the Book of the City of Ladies. The Book of the City of Ladies is her most famous piece. That's the one to remember. It shows the virtue of famous women in history down through the ages, and it is a direct response to the Romance of the Rose. And she set it up, again, like Augustine. He's a very famous model to follow, like Augustine's City of God. So it's set up like that, the City of Ladies. The treasure of the City of Ladies was a book of etiquette and advice for women. And the Book of Peace she actually wrote for the Dauphin, the man who was going to become king in France, as a piece of advice for him. The rest of this chapter is on art, because we are headed towards the Renaissance, and the Renaissance began in Florence, Italy, and the Renaissance is a lot about visual art. Though, literature and sculpting and other things are included, we have a lot about visual art. So we need some background information. First of all, the northern artists in Europe, in France, England, and Germany, continued to be inspired by classical art. And remember that when we use the word classical, we mean ancient Greek and Roman. So those countries are inspired by the ancient Greek and Roman art. Italian artists, however, had been rooted in Byzantine style. When Constantine moved the capital of the Roman Empire to Byzantium, to rename Constantinople, and that is Istanbul, Turkey. When he moved the capital there, art became influenced by Eastern motifs because, of course, Turkey is in the East. So Italy, being, the seat of the Roman Empire, would have been influenced by this Byzantine style, very conservative and traditional. Now, cut to the current time period, the 1300s. The artists are starting to break away from that Byzantine style. Two Italian sculptors who broke away from that were Nicola and Giovanni Pisano. This was a father and son set of sculptors, and the father, like you would think, did more heavily emphasize classical models, Greek and Roman. And his son, Giovanni, had more of a Northern European influence, like the first bullet point, from France, England, and Germany. But both are seen as sculptors who, in a time period that was very traditional, are starting to break away from traditional models. This sculpture, which is in your textbook, page 355, is by the father, Nicola Pisano, and it is a panel that was carved on the pulpit of the baptistry in Pisa, Italy. It is called the Annunciation, which means the announcing of the birth of Christ, and the Nativity, the birth of Christ, and adoration of the shepherds. So very traditional, based on the Bible, as a lot of Renaissance art is, and he is still using a pretty traditional Byzantine style. Now we turn to the Italo-Byzantine ideas in the visual arts. We've been talking about it in sculpture, but we have the same sort of thing occurring in paintings as well. It was around this time period of the 14th century, the 1300s, that naturalism began to appear. A more realistic style of painting, try to paint things as they actually were. So artists were observing the natural world, and they were devising techniques to suggest volume and three-dimensional space. And the beginnings of 3D is quite amazing, and is one of the hallmarks of the Renaissance. So two writers here that we're going to talk about are Cimabue and Buonassigny. So we have Cimabue first, and Cimabue was a predecessor to Giotto, and Giotto we'll see in the coming slides. And I have to bring up Vasari here. That Vasari was a man who wrote about art and the artists during this time period, and his Lives of the Most Excellent Painters and Sculptors is one of the books that are still studied today about art during this time period. So he begins his work with Cimabue, and because he said that Cimabue was the one, he's from Florence, Florentine painter who truly made a break with the past, with his realism, with his understanding of anatomy. There is very much an emotional appeal. He shows corporal weight. So in other words, he is able to show the body as having weight and mass. And in the painting that we'll look at next, which is not in the current edition of the textbook, and it's his Cimabue's most famous painting, but he paints a picture of Jesus on the cross, and he shows, you can see the anatomy, and you can see that corporal weight and strain and that sense of space. Now, Buonarrota, who also paints in this same vein, he shows emotional states of his subjects through their physical appearances and shows a greater sense of space than even Cimabue does. Here is Cimabue's painting of Christ on the cross. You can see the anatomy there in his chest and in his abdomen. You can see the musculature on his arms. You can see the hands that are pierced through, and the feet, and the way the body is sagging, that shows that corporal weight and strain. So this is a forerunner of what we see during the Renaissance, where they reached the same heights of the showing the anatomy that the Greeks did. Remember how good the Greeks were with showing the anatomy of the male? You know, even so much that, you know, there was a book written about the perfect proportions of the perfect male. We have that same sort of thing that is coming back during the Renaissance, because that's what the word Renaissance means. It's a rebirth of the classics of the ancient Greeks and Romans. So here we have the forerunner of that, the forerunner of what we will see in the next chapter with Michelangelo and Leonardo da Vinci and the other masters of this. This painting is in your textbook on page 356, and this shows a sense of space, which shows a new stylistic development. In the medieval paintings, first of all, they were very crowded, and they had a lot of gold used on them. So here you still do see some of that gold, but there is more of a proportion. It's not as crowded, you know, and we see that there is some attempt to be symmetrical with the arrangement, which of course having Mother Mary in the center with the Christ child on her lap. Contrast what you just saw in Cimabue's painting with this one by Duccio, and this is in your textbook, page 359. You see that Duccio's is more Byzantine in spirit. You know, it's more crowded, there's more gold, everybody has a halo, and so it's not quite showing the depth and the realism as we do in Cimabue's painting. Earlier I mentioned that Cimabue was a forerunner of Giotto. So now we have Giotto, who was the one who truly broke with the past, who broke with that Byzantine style in Italy. Giotto was called a revolutionary figure by Vasari. Remember that Vasari is the one who wrote about the painters during this time period. Giotto shows a realism. In the next painting, which is the most famous one by Giotto, you'll see a depth and a volume. He uses light and dark in a revolutionary way. We see a 3D modeling of the figures, and he tries to imitate nature more than previous painters have done. And so we see that more naturalistic style that I mentioned that came from the ancient Greeks and Romans. Here is Giotto's masterpiece called The Lamentation. It is from a cycle of frescoes that were done in the Padua Arena Chapel, showing the lives of Jesus and of Mary. This one is about the death of Jesus. It's in your book, page 358. But what I want you to note here is look at the angels, look at the expressions on their faces. You can really see that natural emotion that is being shown. You see it on the face of Mary, who is holding her son in her arms. You see the more realistic, you see the limp body of Jesus. You see all the disciples, apostles, and his followers, the other Marys who were at the tomb of Jesus. You see the looks on their faces. It's not anything that is just the same on every figure. It's not fake. I mean, we're showing realistic emotion, and it makes it more real to us. And this is a forerunner of the main characteristic of the Renaissance. We are moving now from Florence to Siena. We have already seen one of the Sienese artists in Duccio. Remember that Giotto was from Florence. At the same time that Giotto was painting with new ideas in Florence, Duccio was doing the same thing in Siena. Both Florence and Siena were very wealthy, thriving republics in Italy, and so they had a lot of money to spend on art. So this would be why those two cities had so many artists in them. So we have the influence of Duccio in Siena, and one of Duccio's pupils was Simone Martini. So Martini is known as the one who has some new developments, and he was a proponent of the International style, and that style was the last great Gothic style which blended the Italian and the Northern artist styles. So he is the last great Gothic artist. Gothic, of course, coming from the previous chapter at the very end of the Middle Ages, the High Middle Ages. So we have Martini versus Giotto's solid realism, but Martini's style has more of a grace, sophistication, a splendor, and an elegance, whereas Giotto's that we just looked at is more solidly realistic. And an interesting point we'll see in a couple of slides, and I'll point this out, is from the Lorenzetti brothers. They applied Giotto's realism. They were in painting in Siena, but they applied his realism in a different way. They're not biblical paintings. They are paintings about government, and they did murals in the city about good government. They did frescoes on walls and painted, and so it's interesting to look at their paintings on page 363 in your textbook. Here is Martini's painting, which you see it's very different in style from Giotto's and Duccio's. There is more gold, which is more Gothic. It's more formal and regal than the more realistic paintings of Giotto and Duccio. So we have here, this is called the Annunciation, and this is when Mary was told that she was going to have Christ. So you have the angel who is coming to her and is telling her that you shall have a child and his name shall be Jesus. And then we have the saints on the side. That's the angel Gabriel with Mary. And then the two saints on the side of that. But it is more Gothic. I mean, look at the wings, look at the roundels, which is the round pictures of the saints at the top of the painting. Look at the verticality. Look at those spires that are reaching towards heaven. Now we turn to the late Gothic architecture. The architecture during this time period was heavily influenced by the French Gothic style. And remember, we talked about this in the previous chapter with verticality and luminosity and the very tall spires with the flying buttresses. So all of Europe was influenced by that style of architecture, but we do see some departures from that, most notably in the Florence Cathedral, which was built on a classical style, much like the ancient Romans with the dome. And that figure is known for a dome that was thought of, imagined by Brunelleschi, and then he figured out how to make such a large dome fit and work on a cathedral. We'll see that in the next slide. The Duomo in Milan is very Gothic. We'll see that. And while most of the architecture did deal with cathedrals, and of course, you know, cathedrals associated with the Roman Catholic Church, there were some innovations with some secular public buildings, and we'll look at a few of those. And then we'll turn to England, where we see just an enhancement of the Gothic style in the Perpendicular style. Here is the Florence Cathedral. It is one of the most well-known buildings in the world. You probably have seen it in various movies and TV shows, but it's known for the bell tower here that Giotto designed. And then you see that great dome that Brunelleschi, whom we will study in the next chapter, that he designed the dome here. So it is the Cathedral of Florence. The baptistry is particularly well known because of the artwork inside of it. And as we talk about it in the next chapter, you'll see that a lot of the great masters of Florence did their paintings inside on the walls, did murals, frescoes on the ceilings in the Florence Cathedral. I failed to mention on the previous slide that the Florence Cathedral is also often called the Duomo, D-U-O-M-O. And Duomo is simply the Italian word for cathedral. So while the one in Florence is just called the Duomo, this one in Milan is the Duomo in Milan. So the cathedral in Milan. And you see it's very different from the Florence Cathedral. It is more overtly Gothic. There are some classical elements showing that the Renaissance has begun, like we see in the windows. We do see a type of column, though it's they're much taller than what you would see in classical architecture. Overall, this cathedral is much more Gothic than it is Renaissance. Before I talk about this slide, I want to mention in your textbook, pages 364 and 365, those secular buildings that were on that opening slide, that we do have the Palazzo Publicio, which is in Siena, Italy, which is a square building with a high bell tower, and then the Doge's Palace in Venice, which is again one of the most famous buildings in the world. And it is an Italian public building of its day. Today, of course, it's a tourist attraction. It's right there on the water, as all of Venice is, but it's in your textbook, page 365. Okay, now we'll turn our attention to this picture, which is one of the Gloucester Cathedral. This is in England, in Gloucester, England, and it's just an extreme form of Gothic architecture. Everything pointing upward, and the extreme vertical emphasis. These are characteristics of the Perpendicular style, is what it became known as. And you just see the vertical lines of varying lengths and widths, and these are characteristics of that Perpendicular style. You don't have as much room for the stained glass windows because it's so vertical, but certainly you see the beauty in that and how that would have developed from the Gothic style. As we discussed in the last chapter, while most of the music was written for the church, the Roman Catholic Church, there started to be some musical composers who wrote for the common person. The common person was starting to listen to and enjoy music, so there were some independent secular musicians who wrote music that was not associated with the church. This type of music is called the Ars Nova, which is a title that came from Philippe de Vitry, and it means the new art. It was not as new as it might sound, but it was a different take on the way music was put together. There was a richness and complexity of sound. There were more harmonies. Remember the plain song that we talked about in the last chapter? So we have more harmonies instead of just that one melodic line of sound. And then we have isorhythm as a new method of construction, which means equal. And isorhythm consists of allotting a repeated single melody to one of the voices in the polyphonic composition. Remember polyphony, which is many voices? So it would allot a single melody to one of those voices with a repeating rhythmic pattern, and then it's different length from the melody, and so different notes are stressed on each repetition. So we do have a different form of music during this time period as well. This is a manuscript illumination of the Romance of the Rose. Remember that an illumination is when the priest who copied the books of the time period, mostly priests, not all, but mostly, that they would illuminate or give detail to. They would paint these beautiful scenes around the text, describing what the text is. And this is from The Romance of the Rose, a piece that we mentioned at the beginning of the chapter. And I bring it up because in the middle of this painting, you see a troubadour, a knight who sang love songs to his desired lady, and they were ballads and love songs. It was not anything associated with the church. So this is an example of that secular music that I talked about on the previous slide.